Hi everyone, so this is going to be the first chapter of my fantasy trilogy. It's the first chapter of the first book. Um, I wrote it a few years ago and finally finished editing it at the start of last year. It was for sale on lulu.com and it still is, so if you want to grab it and sort of read along while I'm reading it, you are very welcome. But I basically just want to get my work out there, and YouTube has always been a place for me to get my thoughts out and share my voice, and a big part of sharing my voice is my writing. So yeah, so I'm not really going to give much information about the book. I just want to read it and let it evolve for itself. I would also love some feedback about the sound, the lighting quality, my voice, what you think I could improve just so that I can make it a really nice listening experience. And yeah, Chapter 1, Kaia. Everything was calm, but only for a moment. The lily pad rippled beneath my back, the sun radiating onto my dark skin. Dipping my hand into the clear, warm water, I felt a curious fish poking around it, checking for food. Giggles from Rehia and Arona on two nearby lily pads filled the air as they chatted about the news from around the village that they'd found out at the learning hut earlier in the day. I'd given in and let them drag me along to the ponds to hang out, but usually I would have gone straight home. For a rare moment, I let myself relax and shut my eyes. Kaia, a timid voice called from nearby. My eyes shot back open, and lifting my head, I searched for where the voice had come from. Rui, a young girl around my brother's age, waved to me from the side of the pond. Even amongst the shadowy canopy of the forest that surrounded the ponds, I could see the worry on her tiny face. "He's doing it again," she said. I sighed and pulled myself up. I should have known it would happen. I swept my arms through the water, propelling the lily pad to the side of the pond. "Where are you going?" Rahia called out to me, still lounging on her lily pad. "Martai," was all I responded, barely looking back at them. "Will you come back later?" Arona asked. "Maybe," I replied, but we all knew the answer. Clambering onto the side of the pond, where the long cattail blades tickled my bare arms and legs, I grabbed my satchel from where I'd placed it amongst the purple flowers. Guilt hit me as I waved goodbye to my friends. They didn't understand what I had to do. All they saw was me disappearing again. But there was nothing I could do about it, even if I wanted to. I followed Rui away from the ponds, her thick black coils of hair bouncing behind her just as mine did. We darted across the pathway of wooden planks that waved with the shape of the swampy land, and across the ponds and the sleepy, wide river. Shouts and shrieks came through the trees and bushes from towards the centre of the village, and I broke into a run. Rounding the corner into town, there he was. There they all were, watching my brother scaling the roof of the learning hut. Gripping my satchel to my shoulder, I walked towards the learning hut as the crowd of children and guides parted to let me through. I curled my hands into balls, stretched them out again, and began to climb the wooden slats on the side of the building. It didn't take me long to get onto the flax roof, and I did my best to ignore the way the loose strands poked at my bare arms. In a matter of moments, I was at the top, looking down across the village, the huts sitting by the river running towards the eastern coast of Derna. Martai had nowhere further to climb. He was panting and his eyes were wild, but I could see disappointment creeping in as he realized his fun was over. But I was here. He'd gotten what he wanted. "Enough," I said, and crawled across the roof to get closer to him. There was more to this than just excitement, and as I reached towards him and held out my hand, he didn't need much convincing to give it up. He reached into the pocket of his linen shorts and pulled out a nearly empty glass vial. What was left was a liquid I recognized straight away. My father had taught me how to identify the different oils and ointments that healed and affected humans. The one my brother had taken to help him get up on the roof so quickly was flaming nagos, made of leaves that grew near the ponds and smoked wheat. It could give anyone that drank it the sort of energy that not even a 10-hour sleep could. I swung my satchel around and opened it with one hand, tucking the vial safely away inside and pulling out another one. When I held the new vial out to Mātai, full of a different shade of green liquid, he shook his head furiously. "You need to drink. It will calm you down." I didn't think I'd have much hope of getting him off the roof if he didn't. Eventually, he took it from my hand and slugged it back as little bits of green oil dripped from his lips. Right away, his breath slowed and his eyes became more focused. Taking his hand, I helped to guide him across the rooftop and safely back to the ground. The kids cheered for me and the guides ushered them away, back inside the hut. I wasn't doing it for praise. I was doing it because I was the only one that would. The head guide, Manaya, a woman in her late 20s, stayed back, looking at me and Mātai with frustration and pity. "Take him home, Kaia," she muttered. Mātai's face slumped. "He won't do it again." I wasn't sure of that, but I didn't want him to miss out on the rest of the afternoon with the children. Manaya shook her head and dropped her eyes. "Take him home." She'd been Mātai's guide for 5 years, since he was 2 years old, and me even longer. She knew everything that was going on for us. She'd seen it all. But she still wasn't going to let him stay. She swished away in her ground-length linen dress before I'd even had a chance to reply. Mātai watched the other children through the open front of the learning hut with regret. "Let's go," I mumbled. Mātai dragged his feet across the planks towards our hut, feeling sorry for himself. "Pick up your feet," I said, and after glancing back at me, he walked normally. I wasn't mad for him for what he'd done. How could I be? It wasn't him I was mad at. He wasn't to blame. Ever since our dad had been going on his trips into the rainforest, Mātai's tricks had been happening more and more often. Dad's latest trip had already lasted longer than any of the others, and he never told us when or if he'd be back. He said he was about to discover something amazing, but when he left, it felt like he was abandoning us, just like he always did. I should have known Mātai would do something like this today. It was exactly a month since Dad had left. Mātai darted up the stairs and into the hut, and I sighed and followed him in. He had already gone behind his curtain that hid his sleeping mat. I left him alone, but I'd have to talk to him about his tricks later. Each corner of the hut held a different job for me to do. Dishes were piled in the sink from our breakfast, and there were potatoes that needed cleaning and boiling for our dinner. A heap of clean clothes lay on the couch to be folded and put away, and a dirty basket of clothes sat by the sink to wash after dinner. A row of muddy footprints ran from the back door of the hut to the wash tub, and they'd been there for days. Flax leaves were scattered around the dining table, which needed to be turned into a basket so I could present it to everyone at the learning hut at the end of the week. First, there was something else to deal with. Creeping past Mātai's curtain, I pulled back the curtain around my own sleeping mat and knelt beside it. Flipping up the corner, I pulled up the loose floor plank and reached inside, sliding out an old leather case that belonged to my father. Just as I'd expected, it had been unlocked, and when I opened it, in one of the rows of 20 vials, there was an empty space. I exhaled and reached into my satchel, took the nearly empty vial Mātai had stolen and slipped it back in its place in the case. These oils were not to be used like Mātai had. They were taken from the sap, leaves and bark of the trees that grew around us and further into the forest, and held huge amounts of value if they were used properly. They could aid sleep for a crying baby or strength for the men that worked in the trees. But they should not be used for fun or attention and not for climbing huts. The vials in my own satchel could stay there, like they always did, just in case I needed them. They also reminded me that Dad had once cared enough to teach me about their uses and ingredients. He knew more about the plants that grew around our village than nearly every other Sundana in the village, except for Tunuku, the oldest man in our village, who had taught Dad everything he knew. Taking the carved wooden key I thought I'd hidden well behind another loose piece of wood by the head of my sleeping mat, I locked the case and put it back under the floorboards. I attached the key to a piece of thick string, tying it to the inside of my satchel where no little hands would go. If Martai was going to keep on with his tricks, he'd have to try a little harder now. I went back to the front of the hut and let the valve out of the pipe that came from the roof down the line of the hut, and water streamed into the sink, clean and clear. It had rained the night before, so the pipes were full and needed to be let out. I left our breakfast bowls in the sink and let the water rinse away the sticky remnants of the fresh fruit and sweet corn. I hadn't had time before I'd had to leave to make it to the learning hut. I did more listening than contributing during the mornings with the learning guides. They'd share knowledge and advice like how to perfectly roast a hog, or how to braid back their thick hair, or weave a fishing net. Those were skills I'd already had to teach myself once Dad's trips started happening more often. I didn't enjoy our lessons like the others did, but everything they learned wasn't life or death. They'd never have to learn how to raise their siblings as long as their parents were around. The learning hut bell tolled, and within minutes, children came bounding along the path to their huts, giggling and chatting about the day. They ran into the arms of their waiting mothers. I'm sure they would be telling them all about Martai's latest trick, which would only make the pitying looks I got around the village more common. I always kept my head down and ignored them, but I couldn't help but wish they'd leave us alone. I stood at the sink, rinsing potatoes, gazing out the window. The fire pit was lit down the end of the row of huts, and a few of the women hung large metal pots across the flames, which would be full of food for the village. Children laughed and played while their mums sat around cooking and talking. I imagined what it would be like to look out that window and see my own mum with the other mums. I remembered sitting at her side by the fire, looking up at the tiny baby Martai in her arms as the woman prepared the food. But that was long ago, and she was gone. I preferred to source and cook my own food. I didn't want them to judge me for taking the food the men harvested for us when my own dad hadn't helped in years. The seeds I planted in the soil out the back had been growing steadily and had turned into potatoes and corn, and they cooked well on our own fire. I'd been able to stop relying on anyone else altogether since then. As the sun began to set, the end of day horn blared out from the watch hut at the edge of the forest. Its rhythmic, familiar drone vibrated through my chest and pounded in my ears. The men would have been climbing back down the trees and coming back in from the fields, back to their homes for the night. I often wondered if our own dad heard it from wherever he was in the forest, and whether it made him think about coming home to us. But after weeks of waiting, I doubted it. It was a blessing that Martai didn't have to watch the fathers arriving, today of all days. I dried my hands and stepped away from the window as I heard them arriving, going to the couch to tackle the pile of clothing. A knock on the door drew my attention away from the folding. I crept to the window by the door and peeked out. Through the thin cotton window cover, I watched Ata pacing back and forwards in front of the door, his breathing heavy, his eyes wide. He never came by so late, if at all. Something was wrong. He rapped on the door again, harder and louder this time, and I pulled it open, stopping the noise. Stepping out of the hut, I closed the door behind me. Martai would have heard the knocking, but he might not come out unless he knows who's here. Ata, a tall man in his 40s, was my dad's oldest friend. He was built like most of the men in the village, lean with muscle from climbing the trees and cutting down the crops. Martai was good friends with his younger children. "What is it?" I whispered. I didn't see the point of getting concerned until I knew what was happening. Ata stared at me as if he didn't want to say anything. He soon changed his mind when he saw my impatience. I had a lot to do tonight. "They've brought someone in from the forest," he said. I gripped the door handle and tried to look unfazed, but there was no way to hide my concern. My whole body washed in panic, my head spinning. Is it him? They wouldn't tell us anything more than he is Sindana and he was found unconscious near the start of the ponds. They came to us just before the horn blew, and I came to you from the field. My dad was in the forest. There was a good chance that whoever they'd brought back to the village was him. But other Sindana men worked in the forest, even if it was only at the edges. Couldn't it be one of them? Ata glanced behind me. I turned to see Martai peering out the window. "I'll stay with him if you want to go and find out more, Kaia," Ata said, as I knew he would. I didn't want to leave Martai, but I needed answers. "Don't tell him anything," I said. "Not until I know if it's Dad." I didn't see any point in worrying him yet. He spent enough time thinking about Dad. My own heart was pounding, and I needed to go and find out what was going on. Martai crept out the front door and looked up at Ata, who gave him a warm grin, free of worry he'd just shared with me. "Martai, how was the learning hut today?" Ata wouldn't have had a chance to hear about the rooftop adventure from his children yet. Martai glanced up at me, then back at Ata. "Bad," he sulked. "Let's go inside and you can tell me about it. How does that sound?" Martai shot me a confused look. Ata didn't come into our hut very often. I tried to look calm and told him, "I'm going out for a bit. I'll be back soon." I walked slowly down the stairs through the row of huts as Ata led Martai inside, but as soon as I hit the first bridge, I took off running, straight for the healing hut. The eyes of everyone I passed were glued to me, but I kept my eyes forward and darted across the planks. I arrived at the healing hut panting. Afina, a healer just a couple of years older than me, stood with her back to the door arranging vials on a shelf. I held my breath and slipped past the thin linen curtain that covered the doorway into the back of the hut, just as she turned around. Afina called out to me, but I didn't stop. This hut was much bigger than ours, with a number of doors on either side of a long hallway, which led down towards the riverbank. I slashed at the curtain over the first door, but all that was behind it was a dark room and an empty sleeping mat. I continued down the hall, pulling back curtains, but nearly every room had sleeping or resting people, and none of them were Dad. Another voice called out to me, and when I glanced back, I spotted another, older healer who had long ago been a friend of my mum's, coming out of a room after me. She only caught up to me as I flicked open the last curtain to reveal a man on a sleeping mat, covered in leaves and mud and blood, his chest heaving, his face contorted in pain. I rushed to the mat and stared down at him in shock. "Kaia, wait," Hetty, the older healer, said as she arrived beside me. I couldn't take my eyes off him. He had a deep slice across his face, which was oozing pus. The veins in his face were elevated, like they were filled with something horrible. This was the first time I'd seen him in months, and he looked minutes from death. I studied his face. His eyes looked different. I'd remembered them being more amber-coloured, and now they looked like nothing more than dark circles in his damaged face. But then I noticed his nose. My dad's nose had a permanent bump where he'd knocked himself climbing a tree when he was younger. This nose did not. I stepped back from the bed as I realised this man was not my dad. That is chapter 1 from Kaia's perspective. I hope you enjoyed. It was fun reading it. There are two other perspectives that the story is told in. I've got Talia and Helm as well. So the next chapter is Talia's perspective, and she lives in a different part of the Isle. So yeah, that's what I'll read next. But yeah, this is just a trial, and I'll watch it back and see what I think as well. And yeah, give me some feedback if you would like. Yeah, and I guess we'll have to wait a few chapters to find out who the man is and what happened to him, and whether Kaia's dad is okay, or yeah. So that's that. Thanks so much for watching, if you've watched or listened to this, and yeah, stay tuned.